My business partner of 8 years shook my hand in a boardroom on Bay Street and left me with precisely two things: a severance check, so thin it was practically translucent, and a property deed to my late grandfather's workshop on the Cape Breton coast that nobody in the room thought was worth the paper it was printed on. Felix had always laughed at the Cape Breton place. Your grandfather's fish shack, he used to call it, with that particular brand of condescension he reserved for things he considered beneath the firm. A crumbling old workshop and smokehouse perched on a headland above the Atlantic, outside a village of 400 people and a Tim Hortons that closed at 4 in the afternoon. He signed off on the dissolution papers with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he'd taken and what he'd left behind. I drove 1,100 kilometers from Toronto in November, with everything I owned packed into the back of my truck. The Trans-Canada through Quebec, then east across New Brunswick, the Confederation Bridge, a gray smear of concrete over the Northumberland Strait, and then the long salt-bitten road up through Cape Breton until the headland appeared through the trees. I cut the engine in front of the property and sat there with the heater ticking down to cold, staring at the low stone wall my grandfather had built by hand sometime in the 1950s. 8 years. 8 years of 70-hour weeks, of pitching clients in Calgary and Halifax and Vancouver, of building something I genuinely believed was mine. Felix and I had started the firm as equal partners straight out of our respective MBA programs, and for the first 6 years I had no reason to think the arrangement was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. Then came the series of documents he'd slipped into a routine administrative filing during a particularly brutal quarter, when I was managing 3 simultaneous client crises and wasn't reading carefully enough. A restructuring agreement, a clause buried in the reorganization appendix that reclassified my shares as non-voting preferred, subject to buyout at book value minus liabilities. By the time I understood what I'd signed, the conversion had already been registered with the province. My lawyer told me very gently that I had approximately no legal ground to stand on. I stepped out of the truck. The wind off the Atlantic hit me like a flat hand. The property was worse than I remembered. My grandfather Emmett had died 4 years earlier at 82, and in those 4 years the salt air had worked methodically through the timber. The paint on the workshop had peeled down to raw wood, the roofline of the smokehouse sagged visibly on the eastern side, and the stone path from the gate was heaved and buckled by frost. The main workshop door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside smelled of old oil, wood smoke, and the particular mineral damp of Nova Scotia winters. His workbench was still along the north wall, tools hanging in their outlines on a pegboard he'd painted green. A ship's lantern sat on the windowsill, exactly where it had always been. I stood there for a long time without doing anything in particular, and then I sat down in his old wooden chair and stayed there until it was dark. I spent the first week doing what you do when your mind refuses to stop running the same loop. I worked until my body quit. I cleared the workshop, hauled debris out in contractor bags, pulled dead vegetation from the stone wall, replaced 3 broken window panes. The cold and the physical labor were the only things that quieted the noise. If I was tired enough, I couldn't think about the boardroom. I couldn't think about Felix's handshake. It was on the 5th day that I started on the smokehouse. The structure was small, maybe 4 meters by 5, built from the same fieldstone as the workshop foundation, with vertical timber cladding on the upper half. The interior floor was rough-cut planking laid directly on the ground, or so I'd always assumed. I was prying up a section near the south wall that had buckled badly when I noticed it, the hollow sound. I knocked on one board, then another. Everything to the west of the center beam had the flat, dense thud of planks sitting on packed earth. Everything to the east rang hollow. I went back to the workshop for the pry bar. I scored around the edges of the eastern section with a utility knife. The boards were fitted tightly, but when I got the pry bar under the outermost seam and leaned my weight into it, they lifted as a single unit. 4 planks connected by a batten on the underside, functioning as a trapdoor about a meter square. The hinges were on the north edge, recessed flush with the framing, invisible unless you were looking directly at them. I aimed my flashlight into the opening. Stone stairs, 12 of them, narrow, cut from local granite. The space below was maybe 3 meters by 4, with a ceiling low enough that I'd have to duck. The walls were fieldstone, the floor poured concrete, added later, judging by the contrast. It smelled of cold earth and something faintly metallic. I went down. Along the left wall, a set of rough wooden shelves. Sealed mason jars, their contents gone dark with age. A stack of waxed canvas bags stiffened to boards, and in the center of the far wall, a safe. A Dominion brand floor safe, cast iron, gunmetal gray, with a chrome dial and a small plaque reading Dominion Lock and Safe, Hamilton, Ontario. It stood about 1.5 meters tall, and it was clearly not something my grandfather had moved down here alone. I crouched in front of it. The chrome dial was cold under my fingers. On the bottom shelf, almost hidden behind the waxed canvas bags, was a flat metal cash box, olive drab, dented at one corner. I pried the rusted clasp open with the tip of the pry bar. Inside, 2 composition notebooks with the black and white marbled covers, their spines cracked. My grandfather's handwriting on the inside cover of the first one. I recognized it immediately. The precise, compressed printing of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and treated it like a mechanical skill. I sat down on the cold concrete and opened to the first page. The notebooks were survey records, but not ordinary ones. My grandfather had worked for 3 years in the late 1960s as a surveyor's assistant for the Provincial Department of Lands and Forests before going out on his own, and what he'd recorded here went well beyond his official duties. In July of 1971, he had documented a geological anomaly on his own headland property, a formation consistent with rare earth element deposits running beneath the eastern portion of the land and extending toward the coastline. He had cross-referenced it with a provincial geological survey from 1963 and confirmed his reading with a consulting geologist he'd driven to Halifax to meet in person. In September of 1972, he had filed a provincial mining claim through the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources. Claim number 7741B, 50-year term, renewable. I turned the page. My hands had gone very still. The second notebook was different. It covered 1978 to 1986, and it read less like a technical record and more like a quiet account of something that had frightened him. In the spring of 1978, a company called Harwick Resource Holdings had approached him about purchasing the property. The offer was $22,000 for the headland parcel. A number he had noted was roughly equivalent to the surface value of the land, with no recognition whatsoever of the mineral claim filed 6 years earlier. He declined. The company came back twice more that year through different representatives. He declined again. In November 1978, he received a letter from a solicitor in Halifax informing him that his mining claim was under administrative review due to an alleged filing irregularity. There was no irregularity. He had kept every document. He fought the review and won. But the entries continued. A car that appeared too regularly on the road outside. One of his neighbors was questioned by a man in a suit who claimed to be from the municipal assessor's office. In 1983, the company tried again with a formal offer through a real estate intermediary. $35,000. He declined again. And then, near the back of the second notebook, a single entry stopped me completely. Meeting request from G. Harwick, Harwick Resource Holdings, declined. His son, Felix, enrolled at Dalhousie this fall. Asked around. Seems legitimate, but the name is the same name. Felix. I read it 3 times. My grandfather had written it in 1989. Felix would have been a child. I sat in the cold cellar and tried to arrange what I knew into something that made sense, and the shape it assembled into was not one I wanted to look at directly. I needed to open that safe. The next morning I drove into the village. There was a hardware store on the main road, the kind that sells everything from deck screws to propane fittings, to hand-tied fishing lures, and it was run by a woman named Petra MacDougall, who I vaguely remembered from summers here as a kid. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with short gray threaded hair and the unhurried manner of someone who has no patience for drama, but infinite patience for a mechanical problem. There was a locksmith certification mounted behind the register, beside a calendar from a marine supply company and a photograph of a lobster boat. "I need a safe opened," I told her. "My grandfather's, a Dominion floor model, probably from the 60s. She looked at me over the reading glasses she'd pushed up onto her forehead. "Emmett's place?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Emmett was a good man, paid his accounts on time and never asked for a discount he hadn't earned. She pulled the glasses down. "I can do it. $200 if I get it open, nothing if I don't." "That's fair." She drove out to the property that afternoon in a pickup truck older than mine. In the cellar, she set up a work light, pulled on a pair of worn headphones connected to a contact microphone, and pressed it to the steel casing near the dial. She began spinning it with the methodical calm of someone who understands that patience is itself a professional skill. I sat on the stairs and waited. I told her what I'd found in the notebooks. She listened without interrupting. "Rare earth deposits," she said, still working the dial. "Do you know what the current lithium and neodymium market looks like?" I'm starting to get an idea. There's been a consortium out of Vancouver quietly acquiring mineral rights across Cape Breton for the past 3 years. Mostly old claims that lapsed or properties where the owners didn't know what they had. Click. Click, she paused, reset the dial, and began again. "Electric vehicle supply chain. The federal government is backing it. It's worth considerably more than it used to be." "How considerably?" "Depends on the extent of the deposit. Tens of millions if the geology is what you're describing." I thought about Felix's handshake on Bay Street, his smile, the way he'd said, with such generous sympathy, that he hoped I'd land on my feet. At the 2-hour mark, something shifted in the mechanism. Petra pulled the headphones down around her neck. "We're in." She gripped the safe's handle. The locking bolts retracted with a low grinding rotation, and the door swung open on hinges that were, remarkably, still perfectly balanced. I stood up. The interior was divided into 3 sections. On the top shelf, a stack of manila folders, their edges brown with age. On the middle shelf, a wrapped bundle of old Canadian currency, paper notes from before the polymer redesign, the rubber band holding them long since cracked in two. On the bottom shelf, a sealed tin box, the kind used for storing documents in coastal conditions. Petra handed me the top folder. Inside was the original provincial mining claim certificate for Claim 7741B, filed September 14, 1972. Stamped, registered, signed by the Director of Mineral Resources for the Province of Nova Scotia. Beside it, a renewal confirmation dated 2012. The claim was active for another decade. The next folder held a geological assessment report from 1971, signed by a geologist from the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources. The language was technical, but the conclusion was not. The formation presented a high probability occurrence of rare earth element mineralization, including neodymium, dysprosium, and lithium compound-bearing strata, across an estimated lateral extent of 1.2 kilometers. The tin box was sealed with electrical tape. I peeled it back and opened the lid. Photographs, 24 of them, printed on glossy paper. The first showed 2 men in a restaurant booth, dark wood paneling, a hotel bar setting, Halifax by the look of the signage visible through the window behind them. One man was older, heavy-set, in a business suit. The other was younger, sharply dressed, leaning across the table with an envelope. I recognized the younger man immediately. The jaw, the posture, the particular way he held his hands when making a point. I had sat across a boardroom table from that posture for 8 years. Felix. On the back of the photograph, in my grandfather's handwriting, a date, April 2009, and beneath it, one line. The father sent the son. I don't think the boy knows what he's been sent to do. I sat down on the cold floor. My grandfather had known. He had hired someone to document it, and he had known for 15 years that Felix Harwick, son of Gideon Harwick of Harwick Resource Holdings, had not wandered into my life through coincidence. Felix had been 22 in 2009, the year before we met at what I had always believed was a random networking event in Toronto. The year before we shook hands and agreed to build something together. Nothing about it had been random. Gideon's company had been trying to acquire this property for 30 years. When direct offers failed, when legal challenges failed, they sent Felix. Become the partner. Get close. When the old man dies and the property transfers, make sure the heir is financially desperate enough to sell. Buy it cheap through a holding company. The only variable Gideon hadn't accounted for was the cellar his target's grandfather had sealed 40 years earlier. Gravel on the driveway. We both heard it at the same moment. Petra clicked off the work light. In the sudden dark, I listened. A car door, footsteps on the stone path. Through the smokehouse window, I watched a figure in a tailored wool coat cross the yard toward the workshop. Black Mercedes SUV parked beside my truck. Felix. He hadn't called ahead. That told me everything I needed to know about what he thought this visit would be. I told Petra quietly to stay below. Then I walked across the yard. He'd already stepped inside the workshop. When he heard my boots on the stone, he turned with that practiced smile, fully assembled, warm, a little rueful, the expression of a man who is here to do something difficult for you. I was hoping you'd be around, he said. I drove up from Halifax this morning. I wanted to see how you were settling in. I'm managing this place. He looked around the workshop with tolerant amusement. Very rustic, very you. He set a leather portfolio on the workbench and unzipped it. I've been feeling terrible about how the dissolution went. The legal mechanism, I know how it looked. I want to make things right. He pulled out a document. I have a contact interested in coastal properties. I convinced him to make a serious offer on this parcel. 80,000, cash, unconditional. You'd have the check within 72 hours. $80,000. For a property sitting on a rare earth deposit worth $40 million. I picked up a wrench from the workbench, my grandfather's wrench, heavy and balanced, and set it back down. Before we talk about that, I said, I want to ask you something about your family's company. Harwick Resource Holdings. The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it changed, like a light going out in a room whose curtains haven't moved. What about it? He said. My grandfather kept excellent records, I said. He was that kind of man, meticulous. He had documentation going back to 1971, including a geological assessment of this property, a registered provincial mining claim, and a set of photographs from 2009. Felix was very still. Your father spent 30 years trying to acquire this headland, I said. When the direct approach stopped working, he sent you. You enrolled at Dalhousie. You built a career that eventually took you to Toronto. You spent 2 years establishing yourself in the same circles before we ever met. And for 8 years after we shook hands, you were positioning yourself to leave me with nothing, so that when I needed money badly enough, I'd sell the land, and you'd be there to buy it. The silence in the workshop was complete, except for the wind off the water. You don't understand what this deposit is worth, Felix said. His voice had dropped to the boardroom register, flat, factual, stripped of warmth. The consortium I've been working with has already signed a preliminary letter of intent. The deal closes in 60 days. If I can deliver the mineral rights, I receive a commission of $4.5 million. He looked at me steadily. My father spent everything he had chasing this property. I'm not walking away. The claim is registered in my grandfather's name, I said. It transferred to me as sole heir. Under the Nova Scotia Mines Act, you have no legal access to those rights without my signature. He reached into the portfolio and produced a second document. I've had counsel preparing a challenge to the claim. procedural irregularities in the original 1972 registration. It would take 18 months to resolve, minimum, and you'd be funding your legal defense with nothing. I looked at the document. I looked at him. I thought about my grandfather alone in this workshop in 1978, receiving the first offer from Harwick Resource Holdings, making his decision quietly, filing the legal response himself, driving to Halifax, winning on the paperwork. Be realistic, Felix said. You have no money, no counsel, and I've had 3 years to set this up. Sign the transfer, take the 80,000, and walk away with something instead of nothing. A footstep on the stone outside. Petra came through the workshop door with the composure of someone who had simply finished a job and was letting herself out, which in a sense was exactly what she was doing. In her hand was the manila folder containing the original mining claim certificate and the 2012 renewal confirmation. She set it on the workbench between us and stepped back. Felix looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the registration stamp from the Department of Natural Resources and the legal description that matched this property precisely. The claim is current, I said. The 2012 renewal is a separate legal instrument filed under current procedure, and it has nothing to do with the original 1972 registration your challenge is targeting. I've been on the phone this morning with a mining law specialist in Halifax. I watched his face. She'll be reviewing the documents this week. The investment in his expression, the certainty he'd walked in with, drained away. What was left underneath looked smaller and more cornered, and not entirely unlike what I'd seen in my own reflection for the past 3 weeks. You can leave now, I said, and go back to your consortium and tell them the Cape Breton claim is no longer accessible through your firm. Or I call the RCMP detachment in Baddeck, report the fraudulent restructuring clause in Toronto to the Ontario Securities Commission, and we let the federal process run its course. I set his portfolio on the floor between us. Your choice. He picked up the portfolio. He looked at Petra, who looked back at him with the patient, settled expression of a woman who has cracked open a great many things that did not want to be opened. He left without saying anything else. We heard the Mercedes back out of the yard and fade into the trees. Petra and I stood in the workshop. I'll want that $200, she said. Whenever you have it. I'll write you a check today. I did call the mining law specialist that afternoon, a real call, not a bluff, and she drove up from Halifax 4 days later to review the documents in person. The claim was exactly what my grandfather had filed it as. She began the formal process of registering my ownership of the mineral rights and fielding inquiries from legitimate consortiums, one of which had been working to acquire claims in the area through proper channels for 2 years. There was a letter at the bottom of the tin box, beneath the photographs, folded into a small square, addressed in my grandfather's handwriting simply to me. He must have placed it there when he renewed the claim in 2012, 2 years before he died. He wrote that he was sorry he hadn't told me directly, that he had watched from a distance and hoped he was wrong about Felix, that by the time he was certain, he was 80 years old and didn't trust himself to manage it correctly, and he was afraid that if he told me and I didn't believe him, he would lose the last years of whatever relationship we had left. So he made sure the documents were valid. He made sure the photographs were sealed away safely. He made sure the ground under my feet was worth standing on. I couldn't put the fight in your hands while I was still alive to worry about dropping it, he wrote. But I made sure that when you were ready to hold your ground, the ground would hold back. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. I walked out of the smokehouse and across the headland to the edge of the cliff where the Atlantic ran gray and cold below, the same water my grandfather had looked at for 60 years from the same piece of rock. There was a mining file open in Halifax, a legitimate consortium requesting a meeting, and 40-odd years of careful preparation waiting to finally do what it had always been designed to do. The wind came off the water, salt and cold and entirely indifferent, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I felt like the ground beneath me was actually mine.